today I'm talking about Celtic connections. Now I know there's a music festival in Glasgow called Celtic Connections, and this is nothing to do with that. This is about connections between the languages. Now the modern Celtic languages are divided into two branches. There's the Brythonic or Brythonic branch, which includes Welsh, Cornish and Breton, and the Goidelic branch or Gaelic branch, which includes Irish, Scottish Gaelic and Manx. And you can see the native names of those languages on the screen. Now, just out of interest, how many people here speak a Celtic language? Quite a few. And how many speak more than one? Yeah? Yeah, I know you two speak a bit of Irish and Welsh. What do you speak, sir? Yeah. Oh, yeah, Christopher, yeah. Yes. I recognise you now. You're talking tomorrow about Manx, aren't you? Yeah. Okay. So another name for the Goidelic branch is the Q-Celtic languages. And this this is just the names of them, actually. So in Irish, there are various ways to pronounce the name of Irish, actually, depending on the dialect. I call it Gaelic, but I've heard other people calling it Gaeilge, Gaelin, and various other variations. And if you want to distinguish it from the other Gaelic languages, you call it Gaelic na hÉireann, Gaelic of Ireland. But in English, it's generally called Irish. And then Scottish Gaelic is called Gaelic in Gaelic, or Gaelic na hÉireann, Gaelic of Scotland. And then Manx is Gilg, or Gilk, or Gilg Vaninach. So, and then Breton is Brythonic, or Brythonic, which is, well, Breton sounds quite French. If you hear some Breton, and you don't listen closely, it sounds very like French. I mean, some dialects don't, but a lot of people sound very French. And you may think that's a bit rubbish, isn't it? They're speaking Breton with French accents. But if you think about where the French accents come from, French is a development of Latin, and people in France used to speak Gaulish, which was various Celtic languages. It's probably not one language, every region probably has its own version. So what they speak now includes echoes of the old Celtic language. So a French accent, or French accents, are echoes of old Celtic, perhaps, old Gaulish accents. That's how I like to think of it anyway. Then Cornish is a revived language. It died out in the 19th century, really. No, officially the last speaker died in the end of the 18th century, but she was one of the last monoglot speakers. There were a few other people who had some knowledge of the language into the 19th century, possibly into the 20th century, and it was revived at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, one problem with Cornish, or Cenoic, is that there are several different revived versions. Some of the earlier revivalists, they collected what scraps and fragments remained, what people remembered of the language, and they put together a revived version based on these. Other people came along later and said, okay, this later Cornish is corrupted. It's very influenced by English. So let's go back to the earlier sources. So from the medieval period, there's a lot of written Cornish. So they based their Cornish on those sources. So you have competing versions of Cornish. And then in 2008, all the different Cornish language groups finally agreed on the standard written form. But there are variations on how it's pronounced, depending on whether you like the late Cornish or the middle Cornish. So to me, as a Welsh speaker, I speak Welsh fluently, I live in Wales. I've studied some Cornish, but I don't really speak it very well. Cornish kind of is vaguely familiar. It's the closest language to Welsh, but it's also quite different in some ways. It's more like Middle Welsh, or very formal literary Welsh, which is very different to spoken Welsh. And then, of course, Welsh is Cymraeg or Cymraeg. So on the surface, these languages can appear very different. This is a sentence. Can anybody tell me what this means? I live in Wales, yes, exactly. So the first one is Irish, Tamil Mahoney, Savrat Veg. Second one is Scottish Gaelic, Hami Furach and Sachamri. Then we have Manx, Tami Cummel, Savretin, or Savretin Veg. And then we have Breton, Emao Chom et Gembre, which sounds completely different to the first. You can see the connections between the first three, but then the other three look very different. Then in Cornish, If Esov o Trigis in Cembre. That's one way to say it. You could also say Trigis of e Cembre and Cembre. And then in Welsh, doing Bio and Humri. Now, if when you look at these, you can see between the Goidelic languages, the first few words are quite similar. That means I am. So literally it means I am living. But the word living is different in each one. They come from different roots. They mean to live, to reside, to stay. The Manx and the Irish may be cognate, but I'm not sure about that. And the Scottish Gaelic one is completely different. And then the words for Wales are Manx and Irish are similar. They mean Little Britain, literally. But in Scottish Gaelic, and Brythonic Veg means Brittany. And Wales is a Chymru, which obviously comes from the Welsh, Cymru, which is the Welsh word for Wales. And then, which is connected to the Cornish and Breton words, Cymru, obviously. And then the word for to live in Breton, Chom, so it means I am living in Wales. The Chom actually comes from a French word, chômer. It's an old French word. I think it means to live or reside or abide somewhere or something like that. And then in Cornish, trigis is another word that means to stay somewhere. And in Welsh, byw means to live. And that has cognates in all the Celtic languages, but they mean different things. You wouldn't use it to say, I live somewhere. It means life. So this gives you an idea that there are similarities. The structure is very similar. You're saying, I am living in a place, but the actual words are quite different for quite a few of the languages. Now, this is another sentence, which means the fire is burning. And you can actually see more similarities, because most of the words are cognate. Ta and chinia eglosku. I missed out an S on the Irish there. Ha and chinia eglosku. Tan alia lostje. The word for fire is different in Manx. Chinia also exists, but it's not generally used. Is that right, Christopher? Yeah. Eman and tan oleska. Ema and tan oleski, matan and sloski. So you can see more similarities. It took me a while to find a sentence that had that was similar in all the languages. So the structure is basically the same. You got the verb at the beginning, and then the fire, and then it's burning. So structurally, all these languages have a lot in common, but also quite a few vocabulary words in common. So you have the P Celtic and the Q Celtic. So in the Brythonic languages, some words that begin with P or B begin with K in the Goidelic languages. And they're called Q Celtic for some reason, although Manx is the only one of them that actually uses Q. So this is the word for head. And as you can see, it's pretty similar. It doesn't mean exactly the same thing in each one, but it has, similarities. And it comes from the original Proto-Celtic quenon, from the PIE is Proto-Indo-European cap. And now let's look at some words that are similar in all the Celtic languages. And there are quite a few, actually. And there's only a few that have more or less the same spelling and meaning. So glass is actually an interesting word, because colours in the Celtic languages don't work quite the same as in other languages. Because glass can mean blue or green or grey or various other languages. It's the colour of the sky and the sea, so it varies. basically. And it's more or less the same in each language, and you can see what it means in each one. And actually, it comes from a Proto-Indo-European word that means green or yellow. So colour words kind of change their meaning over time. It's interesting. I have no idea how to say that Proto-Indo-European word there. Anybody know? No. Get or something? Get. Yeah. Okay. Another one that's very similar, Glan. So it's pronounced more or less the same, only Manx's spelling is slightly different, and the meaning is different in each language slightly, but you can see the connections there. And it comes from the same root as the previous word. So something green or yellow has become something clean and pure. Some reason, I'm not sure why that happened. This is an interesting one. Blas means taste, or flavour, or smell. And blasa in the Celtic languages, or blasi in Welsh, means to taste, or smell, or sniff at. And they have similar meanings in the Goidelic languages, but the form is slightly the pronunciation is different, obviously, but the meaning is very similar. Now, there's a program on Radio Cymru, the Welsh language radio station, called Blas, and it's about food. It's a cooking program. And there's another program on Radio Ulster in Irish, which is called Blas, and that's about language. Because in Irish, you can use Blas to mean accent. Ta Blas, although Gaeilge, I have a Ulster accent. My Irish is I speak Irish, basically. So that's an interesting use of the word. I haven't heard it used in the Brythonic languages in that way. Yeah, so I haven't got any further than the Proto-Celtic, so Molasta. So sometimes, going back to the Proto-Celtic, they haven't changed a lot, but sometimes they've changed a little bit. You can see the mla has become bla, because m and b are kind of pronounced in the same way, so it's a common change you find in languages. So actually, when you're looking at the history of words like this, you can see how sounds have changed over time. There's another one. Droch is a nice word. So it's droch in all the Goidelic languages, drog in Welsh, drog in Cornish, and drog in Breton. So quite a useful word, and it hasn't actually changed much from going back to Proto-Indo-European, but the meaning has changed slightly. Now this is one that can one of those false friends. So in Welsh, when you talk about the môr, you're talking about the sea. But in Irish, if you say something is môr, it's big, which we'll look at in a minute. But there are cognates. Mawr in Welsh is large or big, and then môr in Irish is big. So you see, and then môr in Welsh is the sea, and myr is the sea in Irish. So you see interesting changes. So the vowels have changed in these words, but the consonants haven't really changed. So yeah, through working on this is something actually I've been doing for a while. I started collecting these cognates quite a few years ago. There's a section on Omnilot called Celtic Connections, where you can find lists of them. And recently I also started another project called the Celtiadur, which is a word I made up. Celt, obviously, Celtic. Adir is a suffix you have in Welsh and Breton. You have things like a geiriadur is a dictionary, and dyddiadur is a diary. So it's a kind of collection of things, so it's a collection of Celtic. So that's another project I've been working on. It's like a blog, and I have words like this, and I put the meanings and their origins, and I don't just have the modern Celtic languages, I have their, go back to Old Irish, even Primitive Irish, if I can find it, and Gaulish, if I can find cognates there. And so I'm looking at the history of the words, going right back to Proto-Indo-European. And sometimes you find interesting connections. So you think a word in the Celtic languages isn't connected to the other European languages, but when you look at the roots, you can find the connections. So this is, as I mentioned, more for C in the Brythonic languages is more or more in the Goidelic languages. That's quite a straightforward one. And it has a few more meanings in Welsh as well. Now this is one that hasn't changed much over time. The meaning has changed, but the sounds, at least in the Goidelic languages, haven't changed that much. Beg, small, little. But in the Brythonic languages, it's changed slightly as well. So bihan in Breton, bychan in Cornish, and there's two versions in Welsh, bach and bychan. Bach is the usual one, but in some cases you would use bychan. So a slang word for the toilet in Welsh is tŷ bach, little house. But if you want to talk about an actual little house, you could say tŷ bychan to distinguish them. And actually, one of my great-grandfather's house was called tŷ bach. I'm not sure if he knew it was meant. It meant the toilet, so it's just that's a new slang term. I'm not sure. Now, in Welsh, it looks like the other Brythonic languages, but it's actually pronounced D in North Wales and D in South Wales. It's slightly different I sound. That U used to be U as a central rounded vowel, but it got unrounded over time. If that makes any sense to you, if you know your phonetics. So, and in the Goidelic languages, it's pronounced do. So you can see the differences in spelling as well. So in Scottish, Gaelic, and Irish, the final BH is not pronounced. It was in the past, but it's not anymore. And in Manx, the spelling system was invented by a Welsh bishop who kind of anglicised the spelling, and he came up with do like this. So that's why Manx looks very different from the other languages, even though most of the words are quite similar. And another one that's similar, it's, the Manx looks very different there. But dia, it's kind of related. And now, they're all pretty similar. So the root of this one is Proto-Celtic fiselu, under, which literally means under the feet. So that comes from foot, pods, which you can, I'm sure if you know, there's words in English that have a similar root. So you see, you can find the connections like that. Yeah, that's just another example of one word that's pretty similar in all the languages. And another one. So you can see Breton is very different here. Stries, it has nothing to do with the other languages. So you find that sometimes. You've got cognates in all the languages except one. Or sometimes in each language they have a completely different word for the same thing. So I'm not sure where stries comes from, but I think, it comes from koilos, but it doesn't appear to come from pleth. In most European languages, numbers 1 to 3 are very similar. So we've got in Irish, un, do, tri. In Scottish Gaelic, un, ra, tri. In Manx, nen, gis, tri. In Breton, unan, deu, tri. In Cornish, onan, deu, tri. And in Welsh, in, dau, tri. So you can see they're very similar. And you can probably see connections with other European languages there. But other numbers are not quite the same. Here you can see the p, k, p, k differences. So in Irish, caher, coig, she, but in Welsh, pedwar, pimp, chwech. And then going up to 10, there's some similarities and some differences. So 10 is similar in all of them, and 9 is pretty similar. 8 is kind of, yeah, they're all pretty similar in some ways, but some are a bit different. In most of these languages, the word for week is based on the word for 7, so there's something 7 in it. But interestingly, in Welsh, a week is an wythnos, which means 8 nights. Because in ancient Wales, weeks had 8 nights for some reason. There was an extra night they added in. It was a secret, nobody knew about it apart from the Druids. And if you believe that, you believe anything. So here we are. These are the words for week. So Shachtan in Irish, Shachgan in Scottish Gaelic, Shachtan in Manx, Sizoun in Breton, Seithen in Cornish, and wythnos, completely different in Welsh. And now we have a look at some words that are cognate, but in some of the languages they're not commonly used. So, for example, in Irish, ard is high, and there is a cognate in the Brythonic languages, but these words are not commonly used. So they exist, but the normal words for high are different. So uchel in Welsh, uchel in Cornish, and uchel in Breton. And they have cognates in the Goidelic languages, but they mean something different as well. So ursel in Irish and the other languages. And so the meanings have changed, but you can see how they're related. So something high is also noble and highborn and illustrious and esteemed. And now here's another example. So in the Goidelic languages, the words for red, you've got gerug and rua, or roi in the Manx. And they're both used, but the first one is the most common. Rua is often used to describe people with red hair. It's used in nicknames. Donal Rua, Donal with the red hair, red-haired Donal, that sort of thing. And these words have cognates in the Brythonic languages, rose in Breton, roedd in Cornish, and rhydd in Welsh, but that's not a common word for red in Welsh. The normal word for red is coch, which is completely different. And that comes from the Latin cocum, which means a scarlet berry. And then you got the etymologies of each one. So gerug goes back to one that means dark and dim, and then the other one means red in Proto-Indo-European. Now this is an interesting one. So words for sun in the Brythonic languages mean eye in the Goidelic languages. So the sun is like an eye in the sky. So hael, hol, hail in the Brythonic languages become sul in the Goidelic languages. And the words for eye in the Brythonic languages don't have any cognates that I could find in the Goidelic languages. And then the words for sun, Korean, don't have any cognates the other way around. So you quite often find the connections between within the branches, but not always across the branches. And the meanings can be different as well. And here's another example. So words for white in the Goidelic languages, ban, or ben in Manx, don't only have cognates that I found in Welsh, but that's not a common word, ban. And the normal word for white in Welsh is gwyn. And that has cognates in the Goidelic languages, but they mean blonde or fair, fian. And then there's another word in the Goidelic languages, gal, which means white or bright, which they have cognates in the Brythonic languages. So you kind of get cross meanings like this, and words that if you look deeply, you can find these connections, but they're not always obvious. Now, this is an interesting one, because the words for otter, they're literally water dog, duergi in Welsh, dorchu in Irish and Scottish Gaelic, and Manx. But Manx also has another word, morda ushte, which means the same thing, it's just a different way to say it. So the words for water, dŵr, in the Goidelic languages have cognates in the Brythonic languages, but they only appear in this context. As you can see here. So these are old words for water in the Goidelic languages, but the normal words, ishka or ishka in Manx. And then words for dog are very similar. Ki in the Brythonic languages, which have cognates in the Goidelic languages, ku, but that generally means a hound, a hunting dog, a greyhound, whereas the normal words for dog are madra or madu or morda, or in Ulster, madu. So that's one that hasn't changed very much over time, going right back to the root. And then, so horses are complex. So the normal word for horse in Breton is march. You have these other words, kefil and ebul for foal. But then kefil is not commonly used. Then in Cornish, you have march for horse and ebul for colt, which are obviously cognate. And similarly in Welsh, kefil, march is a stallion in Welsh usually, and ebul is a foal or a colt. And these have cognates in the other languages. So you've got capel or cable in Manx. So those are in Irish and Manx, those are the normal words for horse. But in Scottish Gaelic, the normal word for horse is ach, which is the third one down. So the word capel exists, but it's used to mean a mare. So you can kind of see these words all have horsey meanings, but they don't always mean the same thing. And these go back. Capel comes from kapalos, which possibly the words for horse in Latin and the Romance languages, they have the same root. And they came from Gaulish, kabalos. That's what's thought. And then in Latin, you also have another word for horse, equus, which is cognate with the ebul words, the foal words in the Brythonic languages, but in the Romance languages, they don't use that word. So when you're looking into the roots of words and looking at the history of languages, you find out about history generally as well, which I find very interesting. And this is another example of words that don't always mean the same thing and of sound changes. So another thing I've noticed is, like with the P and Q differences, words that begin with G or GW in the Brythonic languages often begin with F in the Goidelic languages. So you've got gŵr in Welsh for man or husband, and then the equivalent in the other languages is far or fair in Gaelic or fair in Manx. And then you have the word dunya, which has cognates in the other languages, but means man. So they have the same meanings, but the sound has changed slightly. And then women. So in Irish, the normal word for woman is ban. And similar in Scottish Gaelic, and in Manx it's ben. And these have cognates in the Brythonic languages, eben in Breton, benin in Cornish, and benu in Welsh. But the normal word for woman or wife in these languages is greg or graig in Welsh. So the first etymology is for ben. The second one is for graig. So I'm not sure if it actually comes from the word for witch. Possibly. Okay, so these are some of the sources I used. First one is my own. First two are my own sources, of course. So Ager, as I said, this is my regular blog about Celtic languages. And sometimes I add examples of how the words are used, and I try and find cognates with other languages. You know, this comes from the same root as the English words for whatever, or the Russian words for whatever, if I can find interesting connections like that. And then the Celtic languages section on Omniglot, where you can find not just the cognate words, but also all the pages I have about Celtic languages. So I've got basic profiles of the languages, phrases, numbers, colours, days of the week, all that sort of stuff. And I try and add to those whenever I can. And then these other ones are dictionaries. Some more. And another very good source for this information is Wiktionary. It's not always reliable. And sometimes you look up a word and it says one etymology, then you kind of follow it down the rabbit hole, and you find, going up a different path, you find a different etymology. So, you know, I try and use different sources to make sure I get the most accurate information available. So that's all I've got to say for now.
I was interested if you've looked at Cymric at all.
Yes, I have a page about Cymric, but there's so little known about it. There's hardly anything written down. There's only a few fragments left of it. You know, there's a kind of reconstructed version of it, which is interesting, but there's not enough information about it really to go into any depth. You know, I'm interested in the sheep scoring numbers. If you don't know about those, these are numbers that shepherds used to use to count their sheep in the north of England, and there are many different versions. So one version I know from Kirby Lonsdale in Cumbria, which is near where I grew up, is Yan Tevra Medra Pimp, Sevra Devra Hovra Dovra Dick. And they either go up to 10 or 15 or 20. And the structure of those ones is very similar to Welsh. So when you get to 15, in traditional Welsh numbers, instead of going 16, you go 1 on 15, then you go 2 on 15, then you go 2 nines, and you go 4 on 15, and you go 20. But in the Cumbric ones, you don't do the 2 nines bit. But it's very similar. So 15 is bumfit. So yan na bumfit, yan na bumfit, evra bumfit, mevra bumfit, tigit. So I wrote a song about that, of course. But that's the only Cumbric I know, if it is Cumbric. So that's possibly the last remnants of the old Celtic languages that were spoken in northern England and southern Scotland.
Thank you very much.